All right, what's up, everybody? I have a bit of a different video for today. So most of the time I do Warframe related content. That's what I've done on YouTube for the past 5 years or so. I've done a couple reviews for some other games here and there. Outside of YouTube, which is really just a hobby for me. I mean, look at my subscriber count. Um, I am a principal engineer. I do a lot of different things from technical work. I work in the tech industry, so I do some technical work. I've been involved in program management, working on EVM managed products as a CAM, which is a control account manager. I also work in business development, like writing proposals and white papers and whatnot. A lot of customer interaction. I'm also a supervisor, so like a functional manager type thing. So a lot of experience in the tech industry. So I'm coming up on about 15 years in the tech industry. So I love video games. That's why I made this channel. Is I really like Warframe and I love video games in general. And I also have all of this experience in the tech industry. So um, especially given the recent events where Microsoft was laid off a significant portion of their workforce, approximately 4%. A lot of that impacted many Xbox studios. I just kind of wanted to throw my thoughts out there, leverage some of that tech industry experience with, you know, games in general. Um, so, you know, and just looking forward, thinking about how can I incorporate some of my professional experience into my YouTube content? It's something I've been thinking about for a while, but this recent, what recently happened with Microsoft kind of gave me the kick in the pants to finally do that. Speaking of Xbox and Microsoft, I just for context and transparency, I do own an Xbox right now. I mostly just use it to like play games with my kids in the living room. Honestly, I've considered switching it out for a Switch too, but I haven't done that quite yet. Overwhelmingly, my primary gaming platform is PC, so that's usually split across Steam, some stuff on GOG, and also Game Pass, which I think is a good deal for consumers. I have owned a PlayStation before. I don't own one right now. I sold mine a couple years ago, but so I don't really have any stake in like console war type stuff. Like I just want good games to get made. Ideally, I'd love for developers to be able to keep their jobs and for them to get the games they're working on out so that we can play them. So they keep their jobs, they have stable careers, and people who like video games get more games to play. That's the ideal case, but unfortunately, that's not really what's been happening in the games industry for quite a few years now. It's been about 3 years where every single year has seen continual layoffs. Really, in the entire tech industry, to be completely honest. I also do a lot of work with hiring at my company, and we basically have stopped hiring. We had an active engineering hiring team, which I was part of for my discipline, and that got shut down a few months ago. So we are not hiring at all. If you see a job listing in the tech industry go up, not just in video games, but in tech in general, there are instantly hundreds of applicants within minutes. So even for not great positions, I will go through hundreds of resumes. And of course, like you have to eventually get to one. So I've interviewed a lot of people that I thought were great candidates. I would have loved to hire if I could, but there was just somebody better. So, it always kills me to make those kinds of decisions, but it's what you got to do. There's only so much funding to go around. Um, so Now in terms of the link to Warframe. Now Warframe's a looter shooter, obviously. So I already brought up the layoffs that occurred at Xbox. So there were also some game cancellations and studio closures. Now, one of those canceled games was reportedly a unannounced project that ZeniMax Online Studios was working on, and this was supposedly some type of Destiny 2 like MMO. Presumably, it would have a lot of looter shooter elements, I would assume. Now, a lot of the behind the scenes reporting has claimed that the game was very good. Play testers, including, QA and executives who tried the game, and seems like everybody at Bethesda and ZeniMax were very excited about this game. They thought it was very promising. And it had been in development since 2018. Reportedly, it had a team in like the hundreds working on it. Now, why would a project like that get shut down? That's kind of the question that I wanted to try to leverage my professional experience to answer. Now, the fact that it had been in development for that long, with a decent amount of staff working on it, is a probably one of the biggest drivers for why that game got shut down. From what I read, it looks like they were targeting 2028 for a release date. Now, that's 10 years of development, so no returns. So it's it can get a little difficult to justify spending that much money on something when you're not getting returns. So after so long in development, with multiple years of development still needed, and not knowing what the market is going to look like, Microsoft likely looked at the amount of sales and the amount of engagement that game would need to make the game profitable, and they just decided it was better to pull the plug, regardless of how good it looked. Now, the key concept here is return on investment, which is something that is very, very frequently used when evaluating a project or a capability or a product. Whether you want to take it to market, keep working on it, etc. So before I go any further, I really want to say, like, I'm talking about all of this in kind of a relatively, impartial way, but I do want to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of people lost their livelihoods. A lot of these people probably had to move, long distances to work at these jobs. For some of these people, these were dream jobs. These were probably very talented people. And it's really awful that this happened for them on a personal level. I don't want to minimize that. So I'm going to be looking at this through a more analytical lens, but I don't want to ignore the fact that there is a human element here. I'm just not going to be addressing it directly. So now, when you're doing this type of analysis to try and evaluate financial viability for a product or a project or whatever, there are a lot of different metrics you can use. For the context of this video, just for simplicity, I wanted to focus on return on investment, or ROI. Now, this is, I'm not trying to make some kind of cold business excuse for what happened, but regardless of people's feelings, this is a core factor that governs what does or does not get greenlit at a company, and what potentially could get canceled, and provides a lot of the rationale for why that happens. Now, a further complication to this whole process is a lot of these metrics that are used to drive financial decisions, such as, calculating return on investment, forecasting returns, which investments should be prioritized, are being either supported or done entirely by AI. Now that introduces an additional challenge where the kind of human elements of this whole process is really entirely lost. So, for example, I know full well that there have been times in my career where I wanted money for a certain project, and I was able to leverage my, connections and people that knew me and people who believed in me to, work on that project and get money for that project. Now, if they didn't know me personally and I wasn't able to have those one-on-one, face-to-face conversations with them and make my case, if they just looked at the numbers, I might have not gotten funding for what I wanted to get funding for. We are moving into territory in the tech field, especially, where things are being done without those types of considerations taken into account. Some maybe like higher up person who really believes in a particular individual or a particular team, they might not have any sway as to the outcome of a decision. It is most likely at Microsoft almost completely automated at this point. There is probably what's called a human on the loop. So you are monitoring that process, and you are, potentially have some kind of impact on the final stage or outcome. But all of everything that goes into that process is largely done without human involvement. And it's just looking at metrics that get calculated from like budgets and schedules and all sorts of different metrics. So it's very impersonal, and it can lead to things that, from a consumer standpoint, don't really seem to make sense. Now, in terms of like making sense, I've also had experiences where I've seen particular products or particular projects which I thought were a very good thing to do. I thought that it was a good that it would be a good engineering decision to fund those ideas. And they ended up not getting any funding because one of the primary drivers was return on investment wasn't there. So I recently worked on a proposal for something. One of my directors asked me to kind of take a look at a proof of concept, put a proposal together, come up with like a basis of estimate. So did all that, and I was presenting it to like our senior technologist team. And now this was a team of engineers, so this was like very senior engineers, so principal, senior principal, or chief engineers, who were, the point of that meeting was to discuss the technical viability of the idea that I was proposing. Now, the very first question I got from the engineers, these weren't even the business people, was, where's our return on investment? How do we sell this? How do we add this to our products? Like that is the driver for everything. Now that is completely like diametrically opposed to the essence of video games, because video games are very much art. And art, it's hard to quantify stuff like that sometimes. So having those conversations are difficult even in tech in general, but it's especially difficult for video games because video games are so hard to quantify from a value perspective. So now ROI, in a nutshell, is it's a very, I know my company uses it as a pretty important metric. Of course, there's others. I don't want to make this like too crazy complicated. That's why I chose to focus on just one thing. So, I've also seen people, especially with Microsoft, saying like, oh, Microsoft makes so much money. Can't they just absorb the cost of these projects? But return on investment is all about making money relative to what you spent. So there are a lot of costs involved. So one of those is labor. One of those is the cost of maintaining Game Pass. There's just Microsoft infrastructure in general. So when KCD2 came out, one of the things that people brought up was that, oh, this game had a very reasonable budget, and they correlated that with the fact that devs in, I think it was Croatia, or it was like kind of like an Eastern European country, they typically have much lower salaries than a dev in like California. I think last time I looked this up, the averages were like 4 times, a quarter of the salary of the average game dev in California. Now, what I want to draw attention to is that is just salary. That is not a total labor cost. So what you really want to look for is compensation, which is the salary of an individual plus their benefits. Benefits could include healthcare. It could include assisting with your retirement fund. It could include things like, memberships to gyms and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of things that can go into your benefits. And then on top of that, you also need to add in overhead. So overhead is, for this employee, what is our cost of keeping the lights on, paying our water bill, paying our mortgage or our lease on our office space, having a computer for them, having the server, infrastructure to support the development that they're doing. That overhead cost could be pretty high in the tech industry because we often need, computers and servers and a lot of infrastructure to do our work. That overhead cost is not insignificant. So you're looking at the total labor cost of a person being potentially 2 to 3 times higher than their actual salary. So, for example, if someone's making $100,000 a year, they're, per hour, even though they're salary, we can break it down to a per hour rate. So their per hour rate is going to be about $50 an hour. Their actual cost per hour is probably in the $150 range per hour. So you're looking at the actual cost of that employee to the company is like 3 times what their salary is. So all this to say, labor is very expensive. And it should be. Humans are important. I know, despite what capitalism says, like humans are important. And especially if you have you're a skilled laborer, you should be, compensated for that skill set. Now, getting back to ROI, we hear all the time that game development costs are going up. A huge portion of that is increased labor costs. So this game from ZeniMax could have been amazing. It could have been absolutely fantastic. But Microsoft did some analysis where, based on their estimate of the market condition in 3 years, in 2028 when this game released, compare that to the amount of money they spent and then calculate the return on investment that they would get, it just wasn't worth it. So they pulled the plug. It didn't matter to them how good the game was. That didn't matter. All that mattered was, is ROI positive or is it negative? Now, another thing that I want to draw attention to is that calculation can be very nuanced. So in my particular field, a lot of times we're looking at contracts. So, we want to get this contract from this company. Now, when we are calculating ROI, it's not as simple as, I can sell this for $1 million. You also need to incorporate risk into those calculations. So using that $1 million example, okay, let's say this contract is $1 million. Awesome. But what's the probability of you winning that contract? Let's say you're in a pretty strong position. There's maybe one other, competitor that's really strong. So let's say it's 50-50. So 50% chance to win. But what are the chances of that contract actually getting awarded? Maybe that, the customer you're trying to get that contract from decides to just not even do it. So let's say that's also 50%. So instead of a return on investment of $1 million that you're going to use for that calculation, you're going to multiply it by 50% and then 50%, and it's actually $250K. And 50% is pretty damn high in those kinds of calculations. A lot of times it's 10%. So you're looking at incorporating 1% of that total amount into your ROI calculations. So it's actually, once you start incorporating things like total cost, plus your projected estimates for how much money something could pull in, plus risk, especially with how volatile the video game industry has been lately, I'm honestly shocked more things weren't shut down. If I'm going to be completely brutally honest, I'm surprised that only a few games were shut down by Microsoft. And I know that sounds really callous, but you have to understand that these are just by the numbers calculations with no human element in them. So now, in addition, it's because this was going to be an MMO, this was going to be a live service game. Live service games come with a lot of sustained cost. Not only do you need to make sure the game is running well, which is something that you need to do for, any game that comes out. You got to do your bug fixes. You can anticipate a few patches to come out. I mean, I've worked on software, like you're going to have to patch stuff. That always happens. Once it gets shipped, you got to do patches. You just have to assume that's going to happen. But in the case of live service, you also need to have a roadmap of new content coming out. And you need to be already working on that content, assuming the game will be successful. Because if you're not already working on that content and you just wait to see if the game is going to be successful, then it's not going to be ready in time to satiate your player base. So in all likelihood, ZeniMax was probably asking Microsoft for funding out to like 2030 or maybe even 2031 because they needed to get to launch and have post-launch support. So once again, I'm just focusing on this particular example because it's recent, but how many live service games has Sony shut down? How many live service games in general have shut down over the past couple of years? Frankly, it's kind of endemic in the industry, and in tech, we're seeing the same thing. I've seen tons of products get canceled or just never get out the door because they're deemed unsustainable. Now, there are some ways that you can try and mitigate this. Now, you can try to budget a little better. You can try and schedule a little better. Make sure your development cycles are more sustainable. So, you can have a game that looks really good, but if your development timeline is not sustainable, then it's not gonna get across the finish line. Now, I think a case study that frankly should be studied across the industry, much less, not just at Microsoft, is Obsidian. Now, I will admit, I am a huge fan of Obsidian. I really love like pretty much all of their games. Now, whatever your personal feelings are about games like Avowed, the fact that Obsidian is getting 3 AA to like low AAA quality games out in 1 year, and they have produced on average a game a year over the last 7 years, is absolutely mind-blowing. When most companies are producing one game in 7 years. And Obsidian's not even a big studio. So I think Obsidian is a perfect case study of how to manage your studio well, get things out the door. There's a phrase that I had drilled into my head back when I was in grad school a very long time ago, like 20 years ago, which was, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So it's very easy to keep polishing a product and try to make it perfect. But there's also this concept of like an 80-20 where 20% of your development, or sorry, the first 80% of your development is only actually 20% of the effort. And the rest of that 80% of the effort comes in getting it to that last 20%. So there are, we always hear about cut content in games, right? Like even in Baldur's Gate 3, there's several areas in the game. There's things in the game files where people are like, oh, this was cut content. It's like, yeah, at a certain point, you only have so much money. You got to get it out the door. A huge part of being a leader is knowing when to cut things off. And that can be unpleasant. Now, I'm not saying release things that are bad or unfinished or buggy. I'm saying because that's what people end up doing a lot of times. You try to keep the entire scope of a project. You try your best to get it across the finish line, but you can't quite get it there. So you just shove it out the door in a horrible state. That's not good. What you should be doing is evaluating the state of your product continually. And if you're projecting out where you're not going to have the money, you're not going to have the schedule to get the whole thing across the finish line, rather than trying to make a mad dash and releasing a terrible unfinished product, you have to reduce your scope. You have to take a critical look at whatever your product is, which in this case is a game, and you might have to completely axe a feature. Like in Baldur's Gate 3, it really looked like they wanted to include the upper city, right? But it's not there. It's not in the game. They probably had to make a hard decision of, hey, if we try to do this, it's too much. So rather than try to do everything at like a 70% quality, they cut that part of the game out and did everything at a 90% quality or 95 or something with that case, because that's such a great game. Now, this is hard to do. It's very hard to estimate things. I cannot stress how often I see people, experienced people, get estimating work horribly wrong. And when they don't update their schedule with their actual costs and actual progress, it leads to these kind of situations where you don't get across the finish line, or you need millions and millions of more dollars to get across the finish line than you originally anticipated. So I think Obsidian is a great example, regardless of your feelings about their games. I think Obsidian is a great example that people should look at to see how to get games out the door. Um, Now, a lot of people are blaming management at Microsoft, or leadership. Now, people are looking at like the people who got let go, which are probably individual contributors, which are kind of at the lowest level. And then they're blaming Phil Spencer, who's about as high up as you go. You know, really above him, it's just a couple people at Microsoft, up to Satya Nadella. Now, I am not absolving Phil Spencer. I think he's done a lot of things wrong. However, there is a lot of management in between Phil Spencer and that dev that got fired. And something that one of my mentors said to me a long time ago was, you get to a point in your career where the best you can do is make everyone equally unhappy. And that sounds really pessimistic. And I was like, man, that's rough. Like, you know, why would you say that? That sounds like a horrible worldview. And the more experience I've gotten, the more true I've realized that statement is. Now, that dev working on their project, they're probably spending all of their time, 100% of their day, working on that particular project. Let's say, but they're reporting to a manager who is looking at 20 projects, you know, or even 10 or 5, whatever. So let's say their manager is managing 4 projects, right? The most that manager can spend on what you care about is 25% of their time. Now let's bring that up to that person's manager, who probably is managing 20 projects or something. Well, now you're down to 5% of that person's time. So in those layers of management, what I've found is a extremely critical skill that, in my opinion, a lot of technical people lack. So in my time as a functional, manager or supervisor, a lot of the feedback I've given people has more been on soft skill development, like communication, rather than technical development. In my experience, developers and engineers are better at the technical stuff than they are at talking about the technical stuff. And when you have so many layers of management and supervisors and project leads and program managers and business development units and blah, 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 by the time it gets to someone like Phil Spencer, a ton of information has been lost. I'm just telling you straight up, he probably didn't even know some of these projects were in trouble. Now, should he make sure he's asking the people that report to him to do their jobs and get accurate information from the people directly below them, so on and so forth? Everybody in that communication chain needs to make sure they're doing their jobs so that the decision makers have accurate information to go off of. Now, that can fall apart really quick. One person who's bad at communicating can destroy that whole chain. It's like when you were a kid and you were playing like a game of telephone and saw how ridiculous the final thing that got said was compared to the initial thing. That happens in professional environments all the time. I cannot tell you how many times I told a program manager one thing, and then I talked to like a vice president about it a week later, and their understanding was completely different than what I had talked about. And then they're going to go talk to business development about that. And it's horrible to communicate in a professional environment. It's really hard. And I don't work at a company that is nearly the size of Microsoft. So a company of that scale, it's even more difficult because they're global. You're talking about potential language barriers. You know, there's so much complexity there. So I'm not absolving Xbox leadership or really any video game company leadership about this, to be honest. I think there are plenty of video game companies that have not managed their portfolios well, and have led to people losing their jobs when maybe they could have gotten those games out and not lost their jobs. However, it's not that easy It's not as easy as, oh, Phil played this game and he liked it and now he canceled it. No, he probably had no part in that decision, to be completely honest. Phil is not out there managing these studios. You know, people are complaining about Xbox's hands-off approach. That's how every company works. My CEO is not coming to me as a project manager and telling me how to do my job. That does not happen ever. That is not a thing that happens in the tech industry, in video games, period. The CEO is in like a way different class of meetings. Like they're basically just in meetings all the time. They're not managing anything. So where they're getting their information from is that chain that I talked about. So and it's hard to do this. Management is hard. I know people like shit on managers all the time and praise devs, and developers should get all the credit they deserve. But people who can do management well and let the developers shine are just as critical to a product or project or video game success as the developers themselves. So, now all that being said, you know, I'm not saying that it's what happened is good or bad. I mean, frankly, I think it's pretty bad. However, I just wanted to leverage my professional experience to kind of shed some light on this. This is really hard. There's no easy way to do this, and it's like nowadays it's increasingly being done automatedly through AI. So you know, I think personally, I think companies need to look at teams like Obsidian. Atlas is another great example. Like, yes, they make tons of side spin-off games of their popular IPs like Persona 5, but they still get games out. You know, they still have a stable revenue. I think Owlcat Games, another like smaller double A publisher or company, but they get games out and their games are good. Are they like amazing game of the year winning AAA games? No, but they get them out the door and they're managed well by all appearances. So, you know, those are just my thoughts. If you have any comments, would love to hear it, but thanks for watching.